Hi, my name is Aaron Ross Powell, and I want to welcome you to the inaugural episode of Reimagining Liberty, my new podcast about radical liberalism and the ideas that influence it. My goal for today's conversation was to set the direction and tone of the whole Reimagining Liberty podcast going forward, and to do that, I brought on my friend Cory Massimino. Cory is a philosophy student and a fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society. He's also one of the smartest young scholars I know, and our talks and Twitter debates over the last several years played a large part in the evolution of my thinking. In today's episode, we talk about the need for the liberty movement to decouple from its historical alliance with conservatism and the American right. We explore the ways reading outside of your comfort zone and exposing yourself to ideas you're inclined to disagree with can be hugely beneficial. And we wander into topics like liberty and virtue, and libertarianism as a project of emancipation. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Reimagining Liberty, Cory.
Thanks for having me on for your first episode. I'm very excited to talk to you and to see your new podcast up and running.
One of the things that led me to this podcast was a frustration with the dominance of conservatism within the libertarian movement. So fusionism, which for people unfamiliar is kind of this strategy where libertarians cozied up to the American right as a way to gain influence within the political party and to affect political change in ways that they thought conservatives would agree with. There was a compatibility between conservatism rightly understood and libertarianism rightly understood. And that this strategy has then informed a lot of what we have seen in the libertarian movement for the last 50 plus years. And in the current climate, it feels like this strategy has at best run its course and at worst has become a tremendous liability with what's happened to the American right and the way that this cuts us as libertarians, as free market people, as people dedicated to radical liberty off from audiences that might be more receptive now to our ideas or at least could bring more intellectual diversity to the movement. And a lot of that has resulted now in, I think if you ask them about libertarianism or where they place us, they think of libertarians as conservative. When I was at the Cato Institute, we would always get frustrated because journalists would refer to us in articles as the conservative Cato Institute. Sometimes the libertarian Cato Institute, never the progressive Cato Institute. And we'd always say, like, why can't we see we're not conservatives? But I guess the journalists can be forgiven for thinking that libertarians are conservatives because libertarians certainly tend to have in the past worked more closely with Republicans than Democrats, put more effort into recruiting from the right than from the left, networking with right-leaning groups versus left-leaning groups, and so on. My question for you is this a ideologically necessary positioning? Like, is it the case that libertarianism is adjacent to or a form of conservatism? Should libertarians think of themselves as on the right or a movement of the right?
Well, I definitely used to. And I think one reason some journalists can be forgiven, as you said, I suppose, is because so many libertarians still do. Institutionally, sociologically, libertarians are very embedded within the American right wing in terms of nonprofits and organizations and networks of people and donors and things like that. I mean, it doesn't overlap completely. Like you said, like Cato probably should not be called conservative. There are so numerous areas that Cato does that conservatives loathe, like stuff on borders or drugs. So I think that institutionally speaking, it unfortunately is very embedded within the American right wing. But ideologically speaking, it's not just unnecessary. I really think it's completely detrimental to libertarian ideas and even incoherent in some ways. I think it's a contingent feature of Cold War politics in a way, and I guess we're having a comeback for Cold War politics recently, so that's maybe not maybe not great for, but I think it really just emerged, like you said, in the 20th century, largely because of contingent political alliances and factions. And even there, it wasn't so clean cut. You had plenty of libertarians who did not like that alliance and would cut against it, or even perhaps in some ways overreact by allying with people on the left who they otherwise wouldn't. But I guess we'll get into more of that. Um, so yeah, I don't think, I think ideologically it's it's kind of a non-starter. I think it's completely detrimental that people, um, both libertarian and anti or non-libertarian, kind of think of the concepts in this way. Like I said, I used to think of it that way. I mean, I come from the right more or less, pretty brief, I guess. Right when I first got into politics, I had a lot of, I from the very beginning I had very libertarian impulses. I was never, you know, socially conservative or religious or anything like that. And I had libertarian impulses, like live and let live. I mean, pretty basic. But then, I very quickly, it seemed like, well, that was who talked in the language of constraining government, who talked in the language of freedom, of expanding liberty. Well, it was mostly conservatives that I could see, and often still is the case. So I think at first, I definitely thought of that too, and it took a while to break out of that kind of completely, and almost like completely reorient myself and thinking about where libertarian ideas lie, in relation to other ideological concepts and parts of the political spectrum. So I think it's contingent. I think it's easier to do away with than people think, but it's very embedded in institutions.
But if we dig into some of those early reasons for the emergence of this alliance, so we can talk maybe later about the pre-fusionist history and where the early movement for liberty originated in and thought of itself. But in that post middle of the 20th century, we had on the one hand, it was an alliance against communism, right? Like the pro-market, like economic liberty, libertarians loathed communism and the Soviet system, and the right were the allies against communism. I think the problem there is that the right wasn't really allied against communism in a broadly pro-freedom direction. It was more of a, like, they represent kind of a threat to the way that we want to rule. And you go back and you read like the really staunch anti-communists, like, Dulles at the CIA, Hoover at the FBI, like these were pretty authoritarian guys in their worldview. They weren't radical libertarians. And, the CIA, like Dulles basically the communists were a threat to kind of the CIA getting to do all of its messing around in other countries and so on. And Hoover was wildly against the civil rights movement because there was a hierarchy that needed to be in place of like who was in power and what views ruled and so on. And so it was never really about advancing a libertarian agenda as it was fighting this thing that was an ideological rival to right-wing, if not authoritarianism, at least like kind of reactionary politics. And I think a lot of it too was that the left was the socially progressive, and also was having a lot of dalliances with communism, and those kind of overlapped a fair amount. But if you look at the early arguments, it was the anti-communism, but also there was this view that liberty is necessary for virtue cultivation, right? That you, like, if you're going to be virtuous, it has to be something that you have achieved on your own. You can't be forced into it. You need to discover this and cultivate the virtues yourselves. So you need the liberty, and the state can't really do it for you. But on the other hand, and so that's where you get the libertarian side of it, but then you get the conservative side of it, in that the conservatives and the conservative traditions and the embedded knowledge in these things are the ones that tell us what virtue is. That virtue is these established traditions and views. And so you need the liberty to cultivate it, but you need the conservatism to tell you what to cultivate, and marry the two, and you get this fusionist project. I guess I'm curious what you think of that particular argument for it, that liberty can only thrive if with virtuous people. The leftist views tend to lead to the breakdown of virtue and the family and traditional organizations and the institutions that give us meaning and so on. And so we can have our liberty, but it shouldn't take us in a leftward direction.
I think that it was probably very counterproductive and still is, and kind of weird to think of it like on the one hand you've got conservatives, all right, well they stand for virtue, and on the other hand you've got progressives, and what's the opposite of virtue? Well, that's vice. They stand for vice, and then libertarians are like somehow outside of this and have like no inherent position on it, and then just like have to decide which one we like hitch our wagon to, like virtue or vice. Like obviously the case is virtue then, but so that's just like I think a wildly like strange way to think about it. I think talk of virtue and morality. I mean, obviously that's omnipresent across the political spectrum. The conservatives have no monopoly on those things. What conservatives stand for are these traditional moralities that we've had for at least a couple decades or centuries to varying degrees. I think often they play really fast and loose with what they count as um, among the things that they want to conserve. But nevertheless, that's separate. Standing for established institutions and institutions that already exist or already embedded within society, maybe even pervasive. I mean, that's completely different than standing for virtue. Uh, the question is, where does virtue really lie, or what parts of traditional institutions are truly virtuous or truly vicious? It's strange to just sit back at the beginning and then decide, well, everything that already exists is on the side of us cultivating virtue. So I think libertarianism is itself offering a position on on at least parts about what virtue is concerned with, because libertarianism is opposed to coercion and force, and of course the idea there is that those things are at odds with a life well lived, with the good life for beings like us. So that's not the end of the moral story. That doesn't exhaust the whole question and the whole issue of what kind of institutions do we think are compatible with that, traditional institutions, new institutions, something else that we haven't thought of. But it's weird for libertarians to see themselves outside of this issue. And I mean, no, I mean, if I at times I find myself agreeing with a lot of what conservatives say, right? Because they're right that I think that a society without established moral norms, or that falls into a kind of nihilism, is completely undesirable, and it would be bad for liberty. It would also be bad for other virtues, for other good things in life, and for sustaining that society. I think falling into nihilism is absolutely to be avoided, but I think it's a mistake to then side with the conservatives and think that other things entail nihilism when in fact they presuppose the opposite, like libertarians' opposition to coercion and force.
I think that's part of, over the last several years, noticing how much, I mean, both sides do this. Both sides, the left and the right, have caricatured views of each other and then spend most of their time arguing with those imagined versions of each other, or assuming those imagined versions are, representative of everyone. But on this virtue thing, it seems crazy to me to think that A, that like the right has kind of a monopoly on virtue, but B, that the left or progressivism or call it social liberalism. I don't want to call it progressivism because that loops in a whole lot of economic ideas and so on. Like, so social liberalism or social progressivism is that any of those people are rejecting virtue or morality. Like, you can find weirdos on the fringes but like, I don't know. I genuinely don't know, like, people on the left who are anti-family or anti-social ties, or, don't believe that there is value in deep social connection, that there's value in, peaceful interaction, that there's like, it's not this like nihilistic rejection of things. It is simply, to oversimplify, it's like, it's a different set of virtues. And and the frustration that I increasingly had is that there wasn't much in the way of arguments for why one perceived set of virtues was better than another perceived set of virtues. It was just, we've got the virtues and they don't. And then it becomes very acute when you see like, okay, but your virtues have you passing like these don't say gay laws in Florida, or stripping, necessary therapeutic stuff from trans kids, or like these really destructive and corrosive, and that's not virtuous behavior, that's vicious behavior, but we're supposed to just kind of accept it as like, well, it's traditional, it's, it's social norms, it's whatever. But I guess virtue is something that needs to be argued for. Like, you have to make the case for why your behavior is virtuous. You can't just assume that it is. And it has to be like in a dialogue. And so this notion of a monopoly on virtue on one side, and that the other side actually consciously rejects virtue, is just entirely unmoored from reality.
Yeah, I think it's very strange. I mean, my view is definitely that, respecting a trans person, a queer person, respecting their identity, their rights to be and present and exist how they want. That's virtuous to me. That's it would be vicious to suppress someone's expression and identity and authenticity like that, and especially to cultivate a kind of culture that pervasively shames, or at worst, as we're seeing now, coercing people and using force to stop them from living the way that they want. Uh, and and again, I think libertarianism is not some like stuck in the middle, doesn't have any positions on virtue in and of itself. It does. I mean, it's a very moralistic view to say that, well, we have a pretty much unviable duty to respect person and justly acquired property. That's a very moralistic view. That emphasizes moral duties and moral obligations to people. And it's kind of ironic because a lot of conservatives now, it feels like they almost criticize some libertarians and much of the left for being overly moralistic, right? For being too on their toes with looking out for failures to live up to our moral duties as people, and that creates such an irony to it. It feels like the conversation is very muddled. I like you said, like it is unmoored from reality to just say that, to give this like partisan understanding of virtue. That's very strange and counterproductive.
So then does it make sense to situate libertarianism, if what we're saying is tying a principled commitment to liberty, or tying radical liberalism to the American right, is a mistake for, not just ideological, but potentially strategic and tactical reasons? Does that mean that we should then tie, as liberty advocates, tie it to the left, or so there be a kind of a counterfusionism with the left?
I don't think that itself is a very good argument for counterfusionism, because if anything, that's recapitulating the same logic that you mentioned earlier drove libertarians into allying with the right in the after World War II. So, just basically deciding which of these imperial powers, the Soviet Union or the United States, do I need to ally with? Well, let's pick the United States, and then here deciding which faction of American politics to ally yourself with. I think another way in which these conversations can be muddled is, what do we mean by because right and left are themselves complex groups and increasingly fractured and kind of diverse. It's hard for me to sit back and like centrally plan like how all right, so like how many people in the libertarian movement, we're going to ally with the right, we're going to ally with the left, we're going to see how this goes. Like, it's hard to run these kind of like experiments and then like conclusively like prove at the end, like, okay, like here's the side that does more for liberty on net or something. Like, I'm of the view that many of the values associated with the left are much more compatible with values of libertarianism, values of respect for people and their free expression and their desire to live the way they choose, respect for social experimentation and pluralism. And I think the right is really hostile to these things. Uh, that doesn't make the left perfect. It doesn't mean I mean anything necessarily about the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. To me, the question of whether we should be doing stuff in the electoral sphere is kind of orthogonal to this whole issue. The issue is conceptually, like for my own psychological benefit and for coming to a accurate, coherent conception of how these values fit together. And what I should value as well, what I'm committed to valuing. I think that for that discussion, I think libertarian values have much in common with leftist values. I think they're both fundamentally attempts at a kind of egalitarian moral framework, and libertarians are allergic to that word, um, but they weren't always. And even in our fusionist era, there's always these kind of breaking through. I feel like people, you know, you have a lot of our major thinkers, I think, that make points here and there that kind of is that strand of libertarian thinking that is counter to fusionism coming through. Hayek wrote about how capitalism was not a good word for what libertarianism is about, and for the kind of economic system that libertarianism would entail. Rothbard spent just a while allying with the left, perhaps too far. If anything, he's a failure mode, I think, of that kind of reactionary, like going too far to and apologizing even for someone like Che in his case. But also, a lot of good came from that alliance, and I look to that alliance a lot as it seems like during that time, at least Rothbard also argued that again, like liberalism emerged in opposition to conservatism, to the old order, to these traditions that are stifling us. And then it kind of fractured into like libertarianism and socialism. And so I think people have their priorities confused and also tend to view other people as like subversive enemies of some other camp. And so they inhibit their own way of like their own conceptual framework becomes like shackled to these like what we said before, basically these Cold War factions that are not necessarily relevant anymore if they were ever conceptually accurate.
I think that's an interesting point about the shackling of the conceptual side of things, because there's a tendency, and I think it's a worrying one, but a often pretty present one, where you essentially reason backwards to the conceptual. So you start with, I want to affect policy change, say, and these are the people who I feel like I can work with on this. And for a long time, it was the case that like if you were looking at the economic questions, and so you wanted to limit the government's presence in the economy, you wanted to roll back regulations, you wanted taking less money from people to then spend on all the bad things the government spends the money on, the American right, or the conservatives, the Republicans, were much more receptive to those kinds of arguments than the left were. And if those were the dominant issues that mattered to you, it was the economic side of things, then you were willing to overlook all of the bad anti-liberty views that the right held at the time. And if you were in the left, there might have been overlap in other areas, like on criminal justice and the social side of things, but they were all like secretly socialists, or all wanted the government regulating everything. And so we couldn't really work with them on these issues that had become central. But the problem, I think, with that is that it gets you into this, because politics is so stupidly tribal and so like, who are my networks? Who are my people? Who are we against? That you end up, it's basically like your friend circles become like one side versus the other. And then you do what we do with our friend circles and our peer groups and our tribes all the time, which is you start critiquing the other guys a lot harder than your own guys. And you're much more willing to overlook bad stuff that your friends are doing than bad stuff, or explain it away, or be like, well, they don't really mean it, or whatever, versus the other guys. And then as that plays out over decades, and you start to think like, well, I mood affiliate more with these guys than those guys. I'm more comfortable talking with these guys than those guys. Then those are the people you're spending time around. Those are the people who you're like, when I want to bring more people in the movement. Who am I going to reach out to? I'm going to reach out to the people I'm comfortable talking with, and then the perspectives that you have available narrow. And I've pointed this out on Twitter a lot, but one of the things that bugs me the most in American political discourse, especially of the intellectual sort, is when people, the only source of information that they get about the views of the opposing side is in essentially is in criticisms written by their own side. So this was if the only thing you know about the libertarian movement is when you read criticisms of it at Slate, or the only thing you know about left-leaning or left-wing ideologies, Marxism, critical race theory, critical theory, whatever these happen to be, is like the explanations of it from Quillette or Jordan Peterson or so on. And all that does is just doubles down that isolation, because of course these ideas look really stupid when all you know about them is what was written in a critical piece about them, that its conclusion is they're really stupid, right? And maybe they are stupid. Like maybe these ideas that the left has or these ideas the right have are stupid, but you're not going to know that until you engage with them directly. And they're probably not stupid if lots of smart people believe them. They might be wrong, but wrong's different than stupid. And wrong's different than evil. And you're never going to get to like why they're actually wrong if you just think they're stupid and evil. But if you're stuck in this like tactical mindset where it's like, who are my friends, who are my enemies, who are my allies, who are not, and you have suspicion of anything that looks like it's ideologically exploring or even just like attempting to understand stuff from other teams, then it just locks in this mindset, and it becomes easier and easier and easier to think that there's no value in stepping outside of it.
Even on top of all the great points that you made, and I think it's worth pointing out, none of this is remotely like partisan. Like this kind of attitude is like pervasive. There's no necessary ideological connection. I don't think I see it all the time. And I can slip into that, and I think everyone can. It's kind of an ongoing thing to be avoided. But even on top of all the points of that, it's so boring. Like, are you just gonna spend all your time reading stuff you already agree with? I mean, it's so boring. Step outside your mental models. Like, try something else on. Try like on a new pair of glasses that help you interpret the world differently outside your house. Like, it's very it's almost like people are scared of adventure. They're scared of they're gonna lose their original beliefs or convictions. And if they're really good convictions, then you're not going to. If anything, you're just going to improve your convictions. You're going to make them more nuanced. You're going to maybe add different convictions. You're going to flesh them out further. You're also going to understand the convictions of people that you presumably have to talk to, live with, interact with, work with. You're going to understand their convictions better. We've been talking a lot about libertarianism and the left, but this applies to every, I think, under the sun, all good faith ideologies, conservatism as well. I read libertarians, read leftists, read conservatives, read their actual arguments. If your arguments are so good, then you're not going to have a problem in your head arguing against whatever you're reading. But
I think
it's a shame that. Oh, go ahead.
I think that the boring point is a really good one. Like every now and then I'll get asked like, what's the best or most exciting book you've read in a long time, like in the last X number of months or years or whatever. And it's almost always books that I disagree with are the ones, because they're the ones that inspire thinking, right? Like reading someone who who sets out my positions exactly would first be a profoundly weird experience to come across someone like that. But it's also like, someone asked me recently, like, what was the most interesting book you read in the last however long? And I think the answer I gave was Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, which is like this absolutely like hardcore Marxist track.
Yeah, it looks bad.
And it is.
But am I doing what I was just criticizing?
But it was one of these books where I was like, I think almost all of this is wrong, but it is wrong in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
and
Wrong in interesting ways is really fun.
trying to think about like why it's wrong is helping me get better at making the case for my positions, or making, figure out how to make my positions more persuasive and so on. And the other thing, and this is something, since this is the first episode of the show, I mean, like, this is one of my goals for this show, is to explore a lot of the ideas that I think a lot of people in like liberty advocacy don't tend to explore. They tend to just dismiss. Not because I think that these ideas are correct, but because they're wrong in interesting ways, but also these broad philosophies, often, even if they're largely like 90% wrong, will have like 10% that's super interesting and that you can like learn from and you can repurpose into your own thinking. Marxism is, very wrong, but has a bunch of like interesting ways to think about dynamics of power and structural incentives and things like that, that you can be like, I can pick up on this, I can learn from this, I can critique it, and so on. And so one of my goals for this show is to dig into those kinds of ideas and say, we can think this is wrong. We don't have to like give up our principles to read these things, but exploring ideas outside our comfort zone is really the only way to like intellectually grow. And then that intellectual growth makes you a better, more capable advocate for your own ideas.
I think I greatly improved my understanding of markets, and also increased my my support for markets by reading Marx, and not just Marx, but Marxists, and but very much Marx, and really trying to like understand and get into that headspace. It's hard when you come from a different, like, you start somewhere else. Some people start with Marx and they have to try really hard to think about whatever Hayek is saying or something. But so it's but my I think my self understanding of the arguments that I've often found compelling and found an intuitive draw in, they only, I mean, some of them went by the wayside. Like you said, like I was saying earlier, my ideas have kind of evolved, as hopefully everyone's does. But others have become a little more kind of fleshed out, and even more of a conviction. And one of those things I think is my support for markets, and reading a lot of just the last couple of years, trying to really understand the case for planning, um, the 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 practical and moral objections to markets, the wide array of anti-market ideas. I mean, just as there's an enormous array of pro-market ideas, there's no just as enormous, if not more, of anti-market ideas, of trying to think outside the box in a way, and come up with creative alternatives to markets. And nevertheless, I came away thinking, markets are still really cool and really underrated by people on the left. Um, and when it comes to the other side, I mean, a lot of the left, especially the more radical left, the anarchist people, I more associate with, their alarm bells kind of go off at talk of virtue, and like, because as we were saying earlier, like, that's the language of conservatism, that's the language of traditionalism, of the old order. And so that's an area too where I'm kind of adding in another kind of weird. That's the area where when I read conservatives, like, it's interesting how you can agree so much about what they're talking about with virtue, but as we were saying earlier, like, the contents of what they're saying does not necessarily map onto what you think is virtuous. But reading that stuff, um, I think both illuminated really interesting aspects to virtue, to the importance of basically transmitting useful moral norms and institutions from generation to generation. That stuff is very interesting and changed my views, and also reinforced my support for, I don't know, I feel like integralists, they say, like, they use it like pejoratively, but my support for authenticity, you know, they say, like, the cult of authenticity. I've heard that phrase, and it's like, yeah. I mean, I don't. It's like the yes meme for that phrase, because I don't know. I think this vision of a world where people can be their fully authentic selves, they can express themselves, they can try out, experiment with different norms and values and practices. Like, that's great, and not at all odds with a vision of a sustainable human community that values society and transmitting moral norms down through the generations. But anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying, like, expanding where you read or what stuff you pay attention to can be, like, pretty fun and kind of surprise you.
And I think we forget these people that the canonical thinkers, whoever it happens to be, whichever side we're on. So whether that's you're reading Hayek and Mises or you're reading Marx or whatever, like those guys were writing their stuff in a dialogue with others, right? Like they were writing it in response to ideas. They were arguing against ideas. They were engaging with alternative ways of seeing things. And if all that we do is read our guys, then it's basically we're listening to half of a conversation. We're not getting we're not even having, so what it means is that we're not even fully understanding our own side because we're missing what it is that they were actually engaging with and that they thought was important enough to try to engage with this way. And it feels like for a lot of it, we forget like what the whole purpose of this stuff is, that, like you can engage in, you can be into political philosophy as a purely intellectual pursuit. And there are people who are, and that's great. But like for a lot of us, it is like we're actually trying to affect change in the world, like positive change in the world. That's the goal. And whether that is in the form of policy change or the form of more like direct action, ground up, make the world better, or some combination of both, we're trying to make the world better in the ways that we believe in. And the only way you can do that by basically using violence to beat the other people over the head to get them to stop doing what you don't like. But the only like positive, humanity affirming way is persuasion, right? Like the liberty movement is very small. The only way it will see success is by convincing more people to sign on to the same set of values and goals that we have. As fractured as those can be and how much internal disagreement there can be, there still is this broad, like pro-liberty direction. But the only way to do that, to grow the number of people, is to persuade them, and that means engaging with them. And so if all you're doing is talking to your friends and alienating other people or telling other people they're not worth talking to, then you're never going to grow the thing. You're never going to persuade. You're just going to keep doubling down on the same little networks and so on. And so it seems like you're just, it's wheel spinning. But it's hard work because it means like we kind of, as just like humans, we don't want to put in the work to understand the people we disagree with. We just want to know that they're wrong and bad. But you really have to put in that work. And if the view is that you should be suspicious of people who are exploring those ideas, because the exploration of those ideas maybe means that they're not really one of us because they're exploring stuff that's not ours, then you're cutting yourself off. And so again, like a goal of this show is to just jettison that kind of unhelpful thinking and say, these ideas matter. And they matter because we think they can genuinely make the world a better place. And making the world a better place is not a partisan thing. It's not that our side wants to make the world a better place and the other guys, their goal is to set out to make the world a worse place. Like very few people think that way. And so we have to figure out how to have these meaningful conversations. And I feel like that all of the incentives in politics run against having those kinds of meaningful conversations.
I agree. I think it's kind of, you don't have to blind yourself to other views to be said to have an ideology, to have convictions, to count as wanting to make the world a better place. I think sometimes it can be frightening because of how many ideas there are. And so there's a tendency to kind of like want to recede into your cozy little safe space of the ideas that that you like, that make sense to you, that are not scary.
Well, let me ask about that then, because that's something, when I have made this point, like on Twitter, about read outside your comfort zone, explore ideas you disagree with, engage with them directly. One of the responses, the frequent ones, is, so you're telling me that I should be reading all of Dinesh D'Souza's books and reading the Flat Earthers and like listening to what the the loonies on this side or the loonies on that side are saying, which, like, obviously there does have to be, as you said, there's a lot of ideas that aren't your own and you can't explore all of them. So how do we figure out which ones are the ones to explore and which ones are the ones that you actually can safely say, I've got it. Like, I understand enough. I don't need to dig into that one.
When you find out, let me know. No, I mean, obviously this is a tough one, and I've thought about this stuff a lot. I have a lot of experience with conspiracy theories, both from when I was younger and more attracted to them, and also family members who are very into conspiracies. And so that it makes it hard if you're trying to, what are we talking? You're talking about being open minded. We're talking about being, charitable and good and act in good faith and read widely and yes, and yeah, at the end of the day, we're all going to die, and we can't read every book. So I don't know if there's much we can say, a priori, from the outset, just from pure theory, like without any context of like how to do this. Because a lot of people are going to say the stuff that you think is worth the time of day and worth reading, they're going to say no, it's not. And I mean, you're even going to get smart people saying like different smart people saying different stuff is either worth reading or not. It's hard out there. I don't think being open-minded means, I like the phrase be open-minded, but don't be so open-minded your brain falls out. I don't think being open-minded means just being like putting on some hat and then like pretending to be like completely impartial with like everything you see or every new argument or thinker. Like context matters and your ideas matter, and you have to meet other ideas where you're at. I mean, I've never researched the shape of the planet myself, but I'm pretty sure it's more or less round, and I don't see any good reason to give the time of day to stuff that's developing these complex arguments for why. No, actually, like you're just wildly off base, and we've all been like wildly misled, and yet at the same time, I'm in the position of, in some people's eyes, being a flat earther when it comes to political philosophy, with thinking we don't need a state. With something like economics, I think there's a lot of insight in praxeology. A lot of people often compare that to being not just as like ridiculous or fringe as the flat Earth view, but like being epistemically similar, like this unfalsifiable. I mean, we don't have to get into a whole argument about economic methodology and philosophy of science, but but I guess the fact is to like be aware that you're also perceived that way by other people on some issues, and all that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's weird if you have no weird ideas, like if you're just buying into like every popular idea, like no matter what, like that's strange. There's no way the mainstream or the status quo is right about everything. But it would be really weird if they were wrong about everything. So like just defining your views in opposition to the mainstream is like a completely lost cause, and like is another way of enslaving yourself to the thing that you're trying to oppose. It's not being open-minded, it's just being closed-minded to different viewpoints.
At the beginning of our conversation, we talked a bit about this problem of situating libertarianism on the right. And well, we're not saying, now resituated on the left. If we as advocates for liberty want to try to counterbalance some of this, like there's been too much focus on talking with and to and taking ideas from the right, and we want to instead try to bring in some ideas outside of it and talk to people outside of it. What's a good place to start? And what I mean by that is, what are ideas from, say, from the left that libertarians can learn from? And what are ideas that we as advocates for radical individual and economic liberty could bring to conversations with people on the left that might be persuasive to them or might resonate with them?
Well, first, what libertarians can take from the left. So libertarians, I mean, we never really got into pre-fusionist libertarians in the in the 19th century were really associated with the American anarchist movement, with Benjamin Tucker's magazine Liberty, and with writers that contributed to that, and other anarchists like Lysander Spooner or Voltairine de Cleyre, and they saw themselves as completely on the side of of labor, of the worker. They saw themselves on the side of feminism and free love and free thought, and then they viewed them and abolitionism, until um, slavery was ended in America, and they thought of and they thought of these things as you know part of the same ultimately emancipatory project. And I think that you know freedom is not just the freedom to conserve, it's the freedom to create. Libertarians are very used to thinking about freedom in those terms instead of freedom in terms of emancipation, and freedom from what has been, freedom from what has constrained people, not freedom to go back to some idealized romantic time in history. um, and I think having that kind of emancipatory mindset and attitude, and seeing libertarian ideas as part and parcel of a broader cause for freedom. It doesn't have to dilute libertarian ideas; it can strengthen them and make them even stronger, I think. And seeing them interconnected with other fights for liberation, whether it's feminism or anti-racism, or we were talking earlier about government bills that were clearly, even on purely, even the most fusionist libertarian grounds, I think ought to be opposed, that are harming trans people or queer people. And so I think libertarians should see themselves. They don't. It doesn't mean you abandon your libertarian ideas. It doesn't mean you just start talking like some imagined version of some annoying left-wing person that you, or some real version of an annoying left-wing person you've talked to. But it just means expanding your range and seeing how this fight for freedom might be interconnected with other fights for freedom as well. In terms of the left, well, the left has a lot of work to do, just like libertarians. I mean, we could all use some introspection, I suppose. But I mean, the left is so allergic to anything smelling of markets, really of individual conceptions of freedom, of individualism. And there are ways of going wrong with individualism, but the left is so wildly allergic to it. I mean, this was so apparent just the other day when AOC, who sometimes sounds like a little more libertarian sometimes, but this was so reflected in her tweet about zoning, and about saying that the problem with zoning was deregulation, and how we need to regulate it further in order to get rid of zoning laws. Did you see that? I mean, sure, if that's going to work, if that works for her, like, she's a politician, there's certain issues to her context. This is what I meant earlier by trying to like plan everything from the outset. But that there is like a sign of like, why is the left so, they need to recapitulate everything, even remotely smelling of libertarian language, into their own thing, even when it's like wildly off base and perhaps deeply confusing the issue at hand. No, the problem with zoning is obviously regulations. That's what zoning thing. That's what it is. So we need less of that.
I read that as a centralization versus localized control distinction on her part, in the sense that, when the left tends to think much more in terms of the federal government oughta do X, and that what she was complaining about was, as I mean, lots of pro housing, pro growth people make the same claims, is that localized zoning control leads to, can lead to these really bad outcomes, because you have very concentrated interests of the people who live in the, who have the big homes that they want to see the property values go up, or they have the views, whatever, like very concentrated interests that can just shut down anything, any proposals, because they can show up at the boards or whatever. Like, and so on the one hand, like, she's right in the sense that, like, if the federal government is removed enough that it could regulate that kind of localized control out of existence by saying, like, no, we're going to have uniform zoning across the country, whatever. Like, so I can kind of like see what she's getting at, but it is this, I think it is this like not recognizing, and this is, I think, a real issue with the left, is the local control is like authoritarian busybodies trying to push people around, whether it is the NIMBYs or it is like Missouri's anti-gay bill or whatever. And what's needed is us in the form of the federal government, which represents like just the people coming together to, institute the general will, which will serve as a corrective. And that's like a more regulation in this direction that they prefer.
Man, you're being so charitable to these American hating leftists, Aaron. I think there's a grain of truth to that for sure. And I mean, this could be there's a very interesting discussion about, I think, federalism and decentralization and the power of local municipalities and how that relates to libertarian ideas. I think that's kind of an interesting, a complex issue. But that's kind of off the point. I totally see what you're saying, but yeah, it's nevertheless, it feels like a need to, like what you were saying, like to phrase it in language that it is conventionally associated with, which is zoning is itself a regulation. That I think that reflects a kind of a hang up on the left, and and obviously markets, the conservatives have dominated the rhetoric on markets, and libertarians who support markets value with conservatives. So you can see a little bit why it kind of spooks people on the left who want a more fair and egalitarian and in many ways free society. I think trying to convey the idea that, I see markets as an outgrowth of freedom. I see them as a countervailing force against traditional established powers, against entrenched interests. And I think often the things that that concern leftists are caused more by coercive interventions into the market. And obviously I'm not the first to make that kind of argument. But I think that really, regardless of the specifics, I mean, leftists and libertarians have that in common of what we've been talking about a lot, of isolating themselves off almost epistemically to these different arguments and different viewpoints.
I guess I think one of the things that a libertarian or a market anarchist or a radically liberal perspective can bring to the left is when I read leftist theory or engage with people on the left, like one of the things I notice is just this, I don't want to say like a lack of really understanding of the nature of state power and the state as an institution, or a lack of clarity about what that is. And that gets to the, as you mentioned, like kind of markets as liberation from all of these, these traditional hierarchies that have just been really kind of relationships of domination, and relationships of, status propped up by norms, but often by the state and so on. Is, I think what the left can learn from this, from one of the big things they can learn, is what the state actually is, what it actually means to use state power, and whether this is like a public choice thing of, the state's interests are the state's interests. They're not the people's interests. The people's interests are secondary, and if they align with the state's interests, great, but the state will protect its own, which the left seems to be very good at in isolation. Like they recognize that in the role of cops. They're very good at recognizing like cops protect their own, but they don't seem to analogize that out well to the regulatory agencies and the government as a whole. But I think what libertarians have been very good at is articulating a theory of political power and like a clear-eyed understanding of what political power is and what it means to use it, and markets as the counterpoint to that power, or the way that we can coordinate and thrive and create amazing things and innovate outside of those kinds of relationships of power. And so my core frustration when I have conversations with smart people on the left is just like not seeing, like, maybe the values might be very similar, the ultimate goals might be similar, but like, Jesus, guys, like, the state is not your friend. And it's not this thing that you can just kind of like put in the service of the workers or whatever. It's an institution of violence, and it always will be.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think even the more state skeptical leftists and left anarchists who I think my points about markets were really directed at as well. They even there they would benefit from more libertarian ideas about the nature of the state. I think that, like you said, oftentimes the left does seem to understand that the state is itself its own private power, its own, if you want to use the word, class, and really the biggest monopoly of them all. But then at the same time, they want to say that it's more malleable than that, and really it's been captured by interests. And so then if you're not talking about police and you're talking about some other facet of the state, like you said, like regulations, then it seems like this different, more idealistic version of the state as somehow being immune to those private interests and reflecting some actual, I'm not sure the right word, maybe democratic control. Then their analysis of the state as like its own private power with its own interest goes out the window, and that's very frustrating. I think the left will go nowhere if they try to achieve emancipation through the state. I think that's what they did in the 20th century. I think it led to some of the worst horrors in our history, and that the left won't get anywhere with their emancipatory goals if they don't incorporate libertarian understanding of the state, and try to create change outside the state and against the state.
I think that's a good spot to, I don't want to say end this conversation, but pause this conversation, because I'm sure this is, to some extent, this is one of the central pieces of the broader conversation I want this Reexamining Liberty podcast to be. And so thank you, Cory, for coming on. It was wonderful to get you on the first episode. You were the dream guest for that. And I tell listeners, you should follow Cory on Twitter. Cory has influenced my thinking on a lot of things, I think more than pretty much anyone over the last several years. I've learned a ton from our conversations and our arguments, and he's made me better at thinking about and articulating and defending these ideas.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the kind words. I can't tell you how much that means to me. I really appreciate it. I've very much enjoyed becoming friends with you over the last however many years we've interacted on social media, and it's been lots of fun. And I've learned a lot as well, and I'm really glad that I'm able to be your inaugural guest here. I have high hopes for the podcast as well, obviously, since we have such similar outlooks. So good luck with every episode you have as well.
Yeah, thank you, Cory, and thank you to all of you who decided to tune in for this first episode of Reimagining Liberty. I hope you'll stick around and enjoy the ride.